Before we dive into today's story, if you're fascinated by World War II history that goes beyond the typical textbook narratives, stories of courage against impossible odds, heroes who had to fight 2 wars at once, and combat records that changed America forever, you need to subscribe to War Rewind right now. The story you're about to hear is about men who were told they were physically and mentally incapable of flying aircraft. They proved everyone wrong. They became the most requested fighter escort group in the entire 8th Air Force. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now, let's talk about the Red Tails. 1944. Somewhere over Germany, a formation of American B-17 bombers flew deep into enemy territory, approaching their target. This was the most dangerous part of any mission. German fighters would be rising to intercept. The bomber crews knew what was coming. But today, they had escorts. Fighter aircraft flying protective formation around the bombers. P-51 Mustangs. The bomber crews looked out their windows and saw them. Distinctive red paint covering the entire tail assembly. Bright red. Unmistakable. The Red Tails. The bomber crews relaxed slightly. If you had Red Tails as your escort, you had the best. Everyone knew it. Bomber crews specifically requested them. Commanders tried to schedule Red Tail escorts whenever possible. German fighters appeared. Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s. They dove toward the bomber formation, guns firing. The Red Tails met them head-on, aggressive, fearless. The red-tailed Mustangs tore into the German formation, dog-fighting, protecting the bombers. The German pilots found themselves in fights they weren't winning. Some German pilots recognized those Red Tails. They'd encountered them before. They knew these particular American fighters were dangerous. Skilled pilots. Excellent tactics. They protected their bombers with intensity that was remarkable even by American standards. What most German pilots never knew, what they had no way of knowing, was that those red-tailed Mustangs were flown by Black American pilots. African-American men who had been told by their own country that they lacked the intelligence to fly complex machinery, that they didn't have the reflexes for combat flying, that they would panic under fire. The Tuskegee Airmen, 992 black pilots who graduated from a training program that was created partly to prove Black Americans couldn't be military pilots. They flew over 15,000 combat sorties, shot down or destroyed over 260 German aircraft, had the lowest bomber loss rate of any escort fighter group in the 8th Air Force, earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and they did all of this while fighting 2 enemies, the Luftwaffe in the air over Europe, and American racism on the ground at their own bases. They couldn't use the same officers' clubs as white pilots. They were segregated in separate facilities, even while stationed overseas fighting the same war. 101 Tuskegee Airmen were arrested in 1945 for trying to enter a whites-only officers' club at Freeman Field, Indiana. But in the air, escorting bombers over Germany, they were simply the best. Bomber crews didn't care what color their escorts were. They cared that the Red Tails brought them home alive. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, how they overcame systemic racism to become military pilots when the military insisted it was impossible. How they proved every racist assumption wrong through combat excellence. How their success forced America to confront the absurdity of military segregation. And how their combat record became the undeniable evidence that led to military desegregation in 1948. The story begins in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America entered World War II. The United States Army Air Corps was completely segregated. This wasn't informal discrimination. This was official policy. The military was segregated by regulation. Black Americans could serve in the military, but only in segregated units, only in certain roles, and definitely not as pilots. The reasoning was explicitly racist. Military leadership genuinely believed Black Americans were inherently incapable of flying aircraft. This wasn't considered controversial at the time. It was treated as scientific fact. The military had studies, assessments, reports from psychologists and military analysts, all reaching the same conclusion. Quote, "Negroes lack the intelligence required for operating complex machinery like aircraft." Quote, "Negroes don't have the reflexes necessary for combat flying." Quote, "Negroes would panic under fire and endanger missions." This wasn't fringe opinion. This was official military doctrine, accepted at the highest levels, used to justify excluding Black Americans from pilot training. Civil rights organizations had been fighting this for years. The NAACP, the Urban League, Black newspapers, they'd been demanding that Black Americans be allowed to serve as military pilots. The military refused, pointed to their studies, said it was a matter of capability, not discrimination. In 1940, political pressure increased. An election year, President Franklin Roosevelt needed Black voter support. Civil rights organizations made pilot training a key demand. Allow Black Americans to fly. Prove you're serious about equality. Roosevelt's administration pushed the military. The War Department resisted. They insisted it was impractical. Training Black pilots would be expensive and wasteful, since they'd inevitably fail. Better to use those resources training white pilots who could actually succeed. But political pressure won. In January 1941, the War Department announced the creation of a segregated Black pilot training program. It would be at Tuskegee, Alabama. Tuskegee Institute, a historically Black college, would host the program. Tuskegee Army Airfield would be constructed nearby specifically for this purpose. The program had two purposes, though only one was stated publicly. The public purpose was providing opportunity for Black Americans to serve as military pilots. The unstated purpose was proving they couldn't. Many in military leadership expected, hoped, that the program would fail, that Black cadets would wash out at high rates, that this would vindicate the military's position that Black Americans shouldn't be pilots. The program was deliberately made harder than equivalent white pilot training programs. Higher standards, more stringent requirements, higher washout rates. Any failure by Black cadets was treated as evidence supporting racist assumptions. Meanwhile, white pilot programs with similar or higher failure rates were treated as normal attrition. July 1941, the first class of aviation cadets reported to Tuskegee. 13 men. They would undergo primary, basic, and advanced flight training. If they succeeded, they'd receive their wings and commissions as second lieutenants. They'd become America's first Black military pilots since World War I. These 13 men knew what they represented. This wasn't just personal achievement. This was a test case for whether Black Americans would ever be allowed to fly for the military. If they failed, the program would likely be canceled, and Black Americans would be excluded from military aviation indefinitely. The pressure was enormous. They weren't just trying to pass flight training. They were trying to prove their entire race wasn't inherently inferior. They were fighting against pseudoscientific racism that said they were genetically incapable of success. Training was brutal. Flight instruction, ground school, physical training, navigation, aerodynamics, military protocol, everything a military pilot needed to know. The washout rate was high. Of the original 13, only 5 graduated. March 1942. the first graduation ceremony at Tuskegee. 5 black men received their silver wings, second lieutenants, Army Air Corps pilots. The first to receive his wings was Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Davis was remarkable. He was the first black graduate of West Point in the 20th century. He'd graduated in 1936. His 4 years at West Point had been brutal. No white cadet had spoken to him except when officially required. 4 years of systematic social isolation, an attempt to force him to quit. He hadn't quit. He'd graduated. Now he was the first black man to command a black flying unit. Davis understood what this meant. In his graduation speech, he was careful, modest. He didn't claim they'd proven anything yet. They'd completed training. Now came the hard part: combat. Proving they could fight effectively. The military still doubted. Many commanders assumed these black pilots would fail in combat. That training success wouldn't translate to actual warfare. That the racist assumptions about panic under fire would prove true. The first 5 graduates became instructors. They trained the next class, and the next. The program expanded. More cadets, more training aircraft, more graduated pilots. They formed the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first black flying unit. All black pilots, mostly black ground crews, black support staff, still completely segregated from white units. April 1943. The 99th deployed to North Africa, then to Sicily, Italy. They were finally in combat, flying P-40 Warhawk fighters, ground attack missions, escort missions, everything fighter squadrons did. The first missions were tense, everyone watching to see how they'd perform. Would the racist predictions prove true? Would they panic? Would they fail? They didn't fail. They flew their missions competently, professionally. They engaged enemy aircraft. Some scored kills. They attacked ground targets. They performed exactly like any other fighter squadron. But initial reports from theater commanders were mixed. Some praised them. Others were critical, said they weren't aggressive enough, weren't scoring enough kills, weren't measuring up to white squadrons. The 99th faced scrutiny no white squadron faced. Every mistake was magnified. Every success was minimized. White squadrons had bad days without it reflecting on the entire white race. The 90th had bad days and faced questions about whether black pilots should be in combat at all. Time magazine published an article questioning their effectiveness, citing unnamed military sources saying the 99th wasn't performing well. The article generated controversy. Civil rights organizations defended the pilots. The military conducted an investigation. Benjamin O. Davis was called back to Washington to testify. He defended his pilots, pointed out they'd had limited time in combat compared to established white squadrons, noted they'd performed as well as any other new squadron, argued that any problems were experience-related, not race-related. The investigation concluded the 99th was performing adequately. They'd stay in combat. The program would continue. Meanwhile, back at Tuskegee, training continued expanding. 3 more squadrons formed: the 100th, the 301st, the 302nd. Together with the 99th, they became the 332nd Fighter Group. The group deployed to Italy in early 1944. Now there were 4 squadrons of black fighter pilots in combat, over 100 pilots. They transitioned from P-40 to P-47 Thunderbolts, then finally to P-51 Mustangs. The P-51 was the best American fighter of the war. Long range, fast, maneuverable, perfect for bomber escort deep into Germany. The 332nd started painting their P-51 tails completely red. Bright red, distinctive, recognizable. The Red Tails were born. Bomber escort became their primary mission. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators bombing German industrial targets needed fighter protection. German interceptors would attack the bombers. American fighters protected them. This was different from the ground attack missions they'd been flying. Bomber escort required patience, discipline. Your job wasn't to go hunt enemy fighters. Your job was to stay with the bombers and protect them, even if that meant letting some enemy fighters escape, even if it meant fewer opportunities for personal kills. Some fighter groups chased enemy fighters, leaving bombers vulnerable because individual pilots wanted to increase their kill counts and become aces. The Red Tails didn't do that. They stuck with the bombers. They flew close escort. If German fighters came after the bombers, the Red Tails engaged them. Otherwise, they stayed in formation. Bomber crews noticed. They started requesting Red Tail escorts. Word spread. If you had Red Tails, your chances of getting home alive increased significantly. There's a myth about the Tuskegee Airmen that became popular. The myth says they never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. Never. Perfect record. The truth is more complicated and actually more impressive. They did lose bombers. Historical records show approximately 25 bombers were lost to enemy fighters while under Red Tail escort. Out of hundreds of missions, thousands of bomber sorties protected. But their loss rate was the lowest of any fighter escort group in the 8th Air Force. The absolute lowest. Other groups had significantly higher bomber losses. The Red Tails were statistically the best at protecting their charges. Why does the myth persist? Because bomber crews believed it. They believed the Red Tails never lost bombers. Perception became reality. Whether it was literally true didn't matter operationally. What mattered was bomber crews felt safer with Red Tail escorts. That confidence affected morale, affected performance, affected survival. And the myth said something important. It said these black pilots, who'd been told they were inherently inferior, were perceived by the men whose lives depended on them as the best. That perception itself was a repudiation of racism. The combat record was exceptional regardless of the myth. The 332nd Fighter Group flew 15,533 combat sorties, 1,578 missions, over Italy, France, Germany, Austria, the Balkans. Anywhere the bombers went, Red Tails escorted them. They destroyed 112 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, destroyed another 150 on the ground, destroyed or damaged over 950 ground targets, trains, trucks, buildings, fuel depots, anything supporting the German war effort. They earned 3 distinguished unit citations. This was a rare honor, given to entire units for extraordinary achievement. 3 times the 332nd was recognized for exceptional performance. Individual pilots earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, 8 Purple Hearts. These were individual decorations for heroism and achievement. 66 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action. 32 became prisoners of war after being shot down over enemy territory. This was the cost. They were in combat. People died. They paid the same price every combat unit paid. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who'd graduated in that first class of 5, was promoted to colonel, the first black colonel in the Army Air Corps. He commanded the entire fighter group. White bomber crews flew missions protected by a fighter group commanded by a black colonel. In 1944, in a segregated military, that was remarkable. German pilots who survived encounters with red tails reported them to intelligence. The reports were respectful. Grudging respect, but respect nonetheless. Skilled pilots. Good tactics. Aggressive in defense of their bombers. Difficult opponents. Some German pilots probably didn't know the red tails were flown by black pilots. Why would they? In aerial combat, you can't see the pilot's race. You see the aircraft, the tactics, the skill. Race is invisible at 300 miles per hour and 20,000 feet altitude. Other German pilots may have known. Intelligence reports probably mentioned it eventually. If they knew, their response isn't well documented. But their tactical reports make clear they took red tails seriously as opponents. That's professional recognition of combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, despite this combat excellence, despite the bomber crews requesting them, despite the decorations and the combat record, the Tuskegee Airmen faced continued discrimination. On base in Italy, segregation persisted. Separate facilities. Separate officers' clubs. Black officers couldn't socialize with white officers, even though they were fighting the same war against the same enemy. The absurdity was stark. In the air, protecting bombers, race didn't matter. The bombers didn't care. German fighters didn't distinguish. Bullets and flak didn't discriminate. But on the ground, at their own bases, the American military insisted on separation. Some white bomber crews wanted to meet their red tail escorts, thank them personally. They'd go to the officers' club expecting to find them. The red tails weren't there, weren't allowed. The bomber crews, white men whose lives the red tails had saved, couldn't socialize with their protectors because military regulations forbade it. The discrimination followed them home. When units rotated back to the United States for rest or training, segregation came with them. Freeman Field, Indiana. April 1945. The war in Europe almost over. Germany collapsing. Victory weeks away. The base had 2 officers' clubs, one for white officers, one for black officers. Officially, they were designated for different purposes, one for trainees, one for instructors. But everyone knew what the designation meant. White officers used the nicer club. Black officers were relegated to the inferior facility. A group of black officers decided to challenge this. They walked to the white officers' club and tried to enter. They were refused entry. They returned the next day with more officers. Refused again. They kept coming back. More officers each time. Base commanders ordered them to stop. Ordered them not to attempt entry to the whites-only club. The officers refused. They cited military regulations. Army regulations said officers' clubs were for all officers regardless of race. The base commanders were violating military regulations to enforce racial segregation. The confrontation escalated. 101 black officers were arrested, charged with disobeying direct orders. This was serious. Courts-martial, potential dishonorable discharge, end of military careers. These men had just spent years fighting in Europe. Now they were facing courts-martial for trying to use an officers' club. The incident generated national attention. Black newspapers covered it extensively. Civil rights organizations rallied support. The absurdity was too obvious. Men who'd fought overseas were being court-martialed for challenging segregation at home. The military eventually backed down. The charges were dropped for most of the officers. A few faced reprimands. The Freeman Field incident became a symbol. These men had fought one enemy overseas. Now they were fighting another at home. The broader question became unavoidable. How do you justify segregating men who fought together? How do you maintain racial separation in a military that depends on cooperation? The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record made the question impossible to avoid. You couldn't claim black pilots were incompetent when they had the best bomber protection record in the Air Force. You couldn't claim they lacked courage when they'd earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. You couldn't claim they'd panic under fire when they'd flown 15,000 combat sorties. Every racist assumption had been proven wrong in the most rigorous test possible: combat. They hadn't just met expectations, they'd exceeded them. After the war, pressure mounted to desegregate the military. Civil rights organizations pointed to the Tuskegee Airmen, pointed to other black units that had served with distinction, asked how the government could justify maintaining segregation when black soldiers had proven themselves equal to white soldiers in every measure. President Truman faced the question. The political calculation was complex. Desegregation would anger Southern Democrats who supported segregation. But maintaining segregation looked increasingly indefensible, given black Americans' war service. July 1948. President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. All military services would be integrated. Racial segregation in the military was over. The order was controversial. Many predicted disaster, said integration would destroy unit cohesion, that white and black soldiers couldn't work together effectively, that this was social engineering that would harm military effectiveness. Those predictions proved wrong. The military integrated. There were problems, resistance. But the military became one of the first major American institutions to fully integrate. And it worked. Military effectiveness didn't decline. It probably improved. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record was crucial evidence supporting integration. Truman's administration pointed to them, said, "Here's proof that black Americans can serve with distinction. Here's proof that racist assumptions about capability are false." The military integration that began in 1948 preceded broader civil rights advances by years. The military was ahead of most of American society. That happened partly because the Tuskegee Airmen and other black military units had made continued segregation impossible to justify. But recognition for the Tuskegee Airmen themselves was slow. After the war, they went home, returned to civilian life. Many faced the same discrimination they'd faced before the war. They'd served their country with distinction. Now they were back in a segregated society that treated them as second-class citizens. Some stayed in the now integrated Air Force. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. had a distinguished career, became a general, the first black general in the Air Force, retired as a lieutenant general. His career was testament to what had been possible all along if the military hadn't been segregated. Most Tuskegee Airmen returned to civilian life, got jobs, raised families, moved on. They didn't talk much about their service. Some because of modesty, some because it was painful. They'd proven themselves in the most extreme circumstances, yet they'd still faced discrimination, still been treated as inferior. That left scars. For decades, the Tuskegee Airmen story remained relatively obscure, known to historians, known in the black community, but not widely known to the general American public. That started changing in the 1990s. More attention to African American contributions to World War II. More recognition that these contributions had been underappreciated. 1995, HBO produced a movie, The Tuskegee Airmen, starring Lawrence Fishburne. Well received, brought wider attention to the story, introduced a new generation to the Red Tails. 2007. Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen collectively. By this point, hundreds had died. Those still living were in their 80s. 60 years after their service, they received one of the nation's highest civilian honors. 2012, George Lucas produced Red Tails, a Hollywood feature film. Mixed critical reviews but brought mainstream attention. The film had problems. Some criticized historical accuracy, some felt it simplified the story, but it made the Tuskegee Airmen known to people who'd never heard of them. Educational institutions incorporated the story into curriculum. Schools taught about the Tuskegee Airmen, American history classes, African American studies, military history. The story that had been obscure became part of standard education. The Tuskegee Airmen who survived long enough to see this recognition had complicated feelings. Gratitude that their service was finally acknowledged, but also pain that it had taken so long. That most of their fellow pilots had died without recognition. That they'd had to wait 60 years. They attended ceremonies, spoke to students, shared their stories. They were modest, didn't claim to have won the war, just said they'd served, done their duty, proven they were as capable as anyone else. As of 2024, fewer than a dozen original Tuskegee Airmen are still alive, all over 100 years old, the last living connections to this story. When they're gone, the story will be history, no longer living memory. That makes documentation important, recording their stories, preserving their testimony, making sure future generations know what they accomplished and what they endured. The Tuskegee Airmen story matters for several reasons, beyond just the military history. First, it demonstrates how racism wastes human potential. The military insisted Black Americans couldn't be pilots. This wasn't based on evidence. It was based on prejudice disguised as science. If the military had its way, 992 talented pilots would never have flown. That combat capability would have been lost because of racism. How much talent has America wasted over centuries because of racial discrimination? How many potential scientists, artists, leaders, innovators were prevented from contributing because of skin color? The Tuskegee Airmen represent just one small example of what's possible when barriers are removed. Second, the story shows the power of performance to change minds. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't win over skeptics through argument. They won through results. They flew combat missions. They protected bombers. They earned decorations. The bomber crews who flew with them didn't care about abstract debates over racial capability. They cared that Red Tails brought them home alive. Performance is persuasive in ways rhetoric isn't. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record made it impossible to maintain the lie that Black Americans were inherently inferior pilots. Third, the story illustrates the concept of the double V: victory over fascism abroad, victory over racism at home. The Tuskegee Airmen were fighting both wars simultaneously. They were battling the Luftwaffe while also battling American discrimination. They succeeded at both. They helped defeat Nazi Germany, and they provided irrefutable evidence that forced America to confront its own racism. Both victories mattered. Fourth, the story demonstrates that integration works. The predictions that military integration would harm effectiveness proved wrong. The integrated military worked fine, probably better than the segregated military. The Tuskegee Airmen and other Black units had proven their capability. Integration just acknowledged reality. This has broader implications. Every argument against integration in other contexts, schools, housing, employment, used the same logic. That separation was natural and necessary. That integration would cause problems. The military's successful integration undercut those arguments. Fifth, the story highlights the gap between American ideals and American reality. The United States fought World War II against Nazi racial ideology while maintaining its own system of racial segregation. The contradiction was stark. The Tuskegee Airmen embodied that contradiction. They were defending American freedom while being denied full freedom themselves. Recognizing this contradiction doesn't diminish their service. It emphasizes it. They served despite being treated unjustly. That's a more profound form of patriotism than uncomplicated nationalism. Finally, the story is about individual and collective courage. The courage to volunteer for service knowing you'd face discrimination. The courage to excel despite systems designed to make you fail. The courage to challenge segregation, even at risk of courts-martial. The courage to keep going when recognition came late, or not at all. The Tuskegee Airmen showed courage in combat. That's well documented, but they also showed courage in simply persisting, in not quitting despite everything, in believing they could prove themselves when much of American society had already decided they were inferior. The Red Tails became legendary among bomber crews, not just because of their skill, but because of what they represented. They represented the possibility that the old assumptions were wrong, that capability transcended race, that America could be better than its prejudices. German pilots who faced them in combat saw skilled opponents. They didn't see race. They saw red-tailed Mustangs flown by pilots who knew what they were doing. That's the ultimate repudiation of racism. In the air, where performance was everything and prejudice was irrelevant, the Tuskegee Airmen proved equal to anyone, better than most. 992 black pilots, 15,000 combat sorties, lowest bomber loss rate in the 8th Air Force, 96 distinguished flying crosses, and the determination to prove wrong everyone who said they couldn't do it. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just fight in World War II. They changed America. Their combat record became evidence that forced desegregation. Their service demonstrated capability that racism denied. Their courage, both in combat and in challenging discrimination, opened doors for generations that followed. They were told they couldn't fly. They flew anyway. They were told they'd fail. They succeeded. They were told they'd panic under fire. They earned combat decorations instead. Every racist assumption, proven wrong, in the most rigorous test possible, combat. And for 60 years, most of them received no recognition, no acknowledgement. They went home to a segregated society, faced the same discrimination, just with the knowledge that they'd proven themselves and it hadn't mattered yet. But eventually, it did matter. Eventually, America recognized their service. Eventually, their story became known. Eventually, the Red Tails received their due. Too late for most, but not too late for history. Not too late for their legacy. Not too late for their story to inspire future generations. The Tuskegee Airmen, Red Tails, the best bomber escorts in the 8th Air Force, and the men who proved America could be better than its prejudices. 1944. Over Germany. German fighters attacking American bomber formations. Red-tailed P-51 Mustangs intercepting them, protecting the bombers with skill and determination that made them legendary. Bomber crews requested red-tail escorts, said they felt safer with those red-tailed Mustangs flying protection. The Red Tails had the lowest bomber loss rate of any fighter group. Statistical fact. What many people didn't know, what some bomber crews didn't know until after the war, was that those red-tailed Mustangs were flown by black American pilots. Men who'd been told by their own military that they lacked the intelligence and reflexes to fly aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen, 992 black pilots who graduated from a program designed partly to prove they couldn't succeed. They flew 15,000 combat sorties, earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, destroyed over 260 German aircraft. They did all of this while fighting two wars: the Luftwaffe overseas, American racism at home. They couldn't use the same officers' clubs as white pilots. 101 were arrested for challenging segregation at Freeman Field, but their combat record was undeniable. When President Truman desegregated the military in 1948, the Tuskegee Airmen's service was key evidence. Proof that racist assumptions about capability were false. Proof that integration would work. Most Tuskegee Airmen didn't receive recognition for 60 years. Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007. By then, most had died. But their legacy lived on. They'd changed America, proven what was possible, opened doors for everyone who followed. They were told they couldn't fly. They became the best fighter escorts in the 8th Air Force. That's not just a military achievement. That's proof that prejudice lies and performance reveals truth. If this story moved you, if the Tuskegee Airmen's courage and achievement inspired you, you need to subscribe to War Rewind right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover the stories that history overlooked or simplified. The Tuskegee Airmen deserved more than a paragraph in textbooks. They deserve their full story. So do the other heroes whose contributions changed history but remained unrecognized for decades.